At 1:54 in the morning on May 14th, 2008, Brian and Annette Swanson were sound asleep in their home in Marshall, Minnesota, when Brian's cell phone started ringing. It was their 19-year-old son, Brandon, and when Brian answered, Brandon immediately apologized for calling so late. He explained that he'd been driving home from a party celebrating the end of the spring semester when his car slid off the road into a ditch. He assured his dad he wasn't hurt and the car wasn't damaged, but the wheels were elevated off the ground and he couldn't get any traction to drive out. He needed them to come pick him up. Brian told Brandon they'd be right there and asked where exactly he was. Brandon said he was pretty sure he was on a back road just outside the small town of Lind, about 10 miles from their house. As Brian woke up, Annette and they both got dressed and climbed into their pickup truck. Brandon stayed on the phone with them, describing what he could see in the darkness around him. He mentioned he could see lights in the distance that he was certain came from Lind. But before we get into today's story, if you enjoy mysterious disappearances and bizarre unsolved cases told through detailed narrative storytelling, then you're in the right place, because that's exactly what I specialize in, and I post new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please invite the like button to play hide and seek, but then actually leave and go to a movie while they're still counting with their eyes closed. Also, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place in southwestern Minnesota in 2008. Brandon Swanson had just finished his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, where he was studying wind turbine technology. He was an intelligent, responsible young man with big plans for the fall. He'd been accepted to Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs, Iowa, over 250 miles away, where he planned to continue his education and major in science. It would be his first time really out on his own, and he was excited about it. The night of May 13th was the last day of classes, so Brandon went to celebrate with friends. He attended 2 different parties that evening. First one in Lind near his home in Marshall, then another in Canby. Several of his friends would later tell police that Brandon had been drinking at both parties, but not excessively. They said he definitely didn't seem intoxicated when he left the second party sometime just before midnight. The drive from Canby back to his parents' house in Marshall was one Brandon had made practically every single day that year. It normally took about 30 minutes along Minnesota State Highway 68. But for reasons nobody has ever been able to fully explain, that night Brandon decided not to take the highway. Instead, he took back roads through rural farmland. Around 1:15 in the morning, while driving along these gravel roads, Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina suddenly veered off the road and slid into a ditch. The car came to rest at an angle, with the wheels elevated just enough that they couldn't get any traction on the ground. Brandon wasn't injured, and the car had no visible damage, but he was stuck. He first tried calling a few friends to come help him, not wanting to wake his parents in the middle of the night, but nobody answered. So finally, he called home. Now here's where you need to keep something in mind that becomes very important later. Brandon had suffered a childhood injury to his left eye that left him legally blind in that eye. This meant he had significant depth perception issues, especially in the dark. He was supposed to wear corrective glasses to help with this condition, but for some unknown reason, on the night he disappeared, Brandon had left his glasses inside his car. As Brian and Annette drove toward where they thought Brandon was, they kept him on the phone the entire time, despite occasional hang-ups and dropped calls. Brandon stayed by his car and tried to help them find him by turning his headlights on and off, flashing them repeatedly. His parents did the same thing with their truck's headlights, but neither Brandon nor his parents could see each other's lights. They drove around the area near Lind for almost 30 minutes, with Brandon continuously describing what he could see, trying to help guide them to his location. But they just couldn't find each other. Finally, Brandon told his parents he was going to leave the car and start walking toward the lights he could see in the distance, which he was convinced were coming from the town of Lind. His father told him to walk to the parking lot of a local bar they both knew in Lind, and they'd meet him there. Brandon agreed and started walking, still keeping his dad on the phone. He told his father he was cutting through fields to save time, climbing over fences, walking along what felt like gravel roads. It was cold that night, just under 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but Brandon seemed calm and confident about where he was going. For nearly 47 minutes total, Brandon stayed on the phone with his parents as he walked through the darkness toward what he believed was salvation. And then suddenly, Brandon interrupted himself mid-sentence and yelled two words that would haunt his parents forever. "Oh, shit." And then the line went silent. Brian called out Brandon's name over and over, but there was no response. No sounds of struggle, no heavy breathing, no rustling, nothing. Just complete silence. After a minute or so of calling his son's name into the void, Brian hung up and immediately tried calling Brandon back. The phone rang, but Brandon didn't answer. They tried again and again. Each time the phone would ring several times before going to voicemail. This was important because it meant the phone was still on and operational. It just wasn't being answered. By 6:30 that morning, after hours of desperately searching the Lind area and getting no response from Brandon's phone, Brian and Annette called the police to report their son missing. But the initial response from local law enforcement was frustrating and, in retrospect, tragic. The officers they spoke with told them that it wasn't at all unusual for a young man Brandon's age to stay out all night. One officer even reportedly said, "It's his right to be missing." They advised the worried parents to just wait, that Brandon would probably turn up on his own. But Brandon's parents knew something was terribly wrong, and it gets worse. That afternoon, when police finally did start taking the case seriously and obtained Brandon's cell phone records, they discovered something that made the entire situation infinitely more confusing and disturbing. The records showed that when Brandon had been talking to his parents and telling them he was near Lind, he wasn't anywhere near Lind at all. The cell phone pings placed him near the town of Porter, which was roughly 25 miles in the opposite direction from where he thought he was. Searchers quickly located Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina on the afternoon of May 14th, stuck in a ditch along a rural road on the border between Lincoln and Lyon counties, about a mile and a half north of Highway 68, near the small towns of Taunton and Porter. The car was exactly as Brandon had described. It was positioned on a slight incline with the wheels elevated just enough that they couldn't get traction. But there was no sign of Brandon. The car doors were unlocked, and Brandon's glasses were inside. But his keys were missing and have never been found. There were no signs of foul play, no blood, no evidence of a struggle, nothing that indicated anything violent had happened. What followed was one of the most extensive and well-documented searches in Minnesota history. Hundreds of volunteers combed through 122 square miles of farmland and wilderness. Search dogs were brought in from 9 different states. The dogs immediately picked up Brandon's scent and led searchers away from the car, through fields, along gravel roads, for about 3 miles until they reached the Yellow Medicine River. The river at that time was flowing high and fast, knee-deep in some areas, and up to 15 feet deep in others. The dogs indicated that Brandon's scent went to the river, crossed it, and continued along the far bank heading north toward the Yellow Medicine County line, where the trail suddenly ended. Authorities initially believed Brandon must have fallen into the river and drowned. But here's the thing. Extensive searches of the river using divers, boats, and specialized equipment found absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, no phone, no car keys, nothing. And if Brandon had drowned in the river, his body should have washed downstream and been recovered relatively quickly. But it wasn't. The search continued for years, with efforts focusing on different areas, including Mud Creek, a tributary north of Porter, after cadaver dogs indicated the scent of human remains there in 2010. But again, nothing was ever found. And remember how Brandon's phone kept ringing when his parents tried to call him back? It continued to ring and go to voicemail for 2 full days after Brandon disappeared, until May 16th. This detail is crucial because if Brandon had fallen into water and his phone had gotten wet, calls would have gone straight to voicemail with maybe 1 ring or no rings at all. The fact that it rang multiple times for 2 days suggests the phone was still functional and on dry land somewhere. So what really happened to Brandon Swanson? The theories range from tragic accidents to something far more sinister. Some investigators believe Brandon became disoriented in the dark, especially without his glasses to help with his depth perception, and fell into one of the many unmarked cisterns or wells that dot the rural Minnesota landscape. Others think he did fall into the Yellow Medicine River, managed to climb out on the far side, but then died from hypothermia in the 40-degree temperatures while trying to find help. There's also a theory that he was picked up by someone driving by on those rural roads, either someone who wanted to help or someone with darker intentions, though there's no evidence to support this. Law enforcement officially states there's no evidence of foul play, but they also can't explain how someone could vanish so completely. Brandon's mother, Annette, has said she doesn't believe her son drowned in the Yellow Medicine River, despite what the search dogs seem to indicate. To this day, tips still come into the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, but none have led to any answers. Brandon Swanson's disappearance did lead to one tangible result. His mother, Annette, frustrated by the initial police response that Brandon had a right to be missing, met with Minnesota House Minority Leader Marty Seifert to discuss her son's case. Seifert introduced a bill that came to be known as Brandon's Law, which requires Minnesota law enforcement to immediately begin investigating missing adult cases for anyone under 21, or for older adults when dangerous circumstances are present. The law passed unanimously through both houses of the Minnesota legislature and was signed by Governor Tim Pawlenty in May 2009, with the Swanson family present at the ceremony. 4 other states have since passed similar legislation. Brandon's parents kept their porch light on every single night for at least 5 years after he disappeared, as a symbol of their hope that their son would somehow find his way home. More than 16 years later, they still have no answers about what happened to their son during those final moments on the phone when he suddenly said, "Oh shit," and then vanished into the darkness of rural Minnesota. So that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya.